In 1992, Noam Chomsky published a book called What Uncle Sam Really Wants, and in this book there is a section entitled The Crucifixion of El Salvador that basically talks about the military junta that was supported and sponsored by the United States. It's a really good excerpt, and it's probably my favorite part of the book, and I really felt as though I needed to do something about this for the channel, so today I present to you The Crucifixion of El Salvador by Noam Chomsky. For many years, repression, torture, and murder were carried on in El Salvador by dictators installed and supported by our government. A matter of no interest here, the story was virtually never covered. By the late 1970s, however, the US government began to be concerned about a couple of things. One was that Somoza, the dictator of Nicaragua, was losing control. The US was losing a major base for its exercise of force in the region. A second danger was even more threatening. In El Salvador in the 1970s, there was a growth of what were called popular organizations, peasant associations, cooperatives, unions, church-based Bible study groups that evolved into self-help groups, etc., that raised the threat of democracy. In February 1980, the Archbishop of El Salvador, Oscar Romero, sent a letter to President Carter in which he begged him not to send military aid to the junta that ran the country. He said such aid would be used to sharpen injustice and repression against the people's organizations, which were struggling for respect for their most basic human rights. Hardly news to Washington, needless to say. A few weeks later, Archbishop Romero was assassinated while saying a mass. The neo-Nazi Roberto Dubuisson is generally assumed to be responsible for this assassination, among countless other atrocities. Dubuisson was leader for life of the Arena Party, which now governs El Salvador. Members of the party, like current Salvadoran president Alfredo Cristiani, had to take a blood oath of loyalty to him. Thousands of peasants and urban poor took part in a commemorative mass a decade later, along with many foreign bishops, but the U.S. was notable by its absence. The Salvadorian Church formally proposed Romero for sainthood. All of this passed with scarcely a mention in the country that funded and trained Romero's assassins. The New York Times published no editorial on the assassination when it occurred, or in the years that followed, and no editorial or news report on the commemoration. On March 7, 1980, 2 weeks before the assassination, a state of siege had been instituted in El Salvador, and the war against the population began in force with continued U.S. support and involvement. The first major attack was a big massacre at the Rio Sampol, a coordinated military operation of the Honduran and Salvadoran armies in which at least 600 people were butchered. Infants were cut to pieces with machetes, and women were tortured and drowned. Pieces of bodies were found in the river for days afterwards. There were church observers, so the information came out immediately, but the mainstream U.S. media didn't think it was worth reporting. Peasants were the main victim of this war, along with labor organizers, students, priests, or anyone suspected of working for the interests of the people. In Carter's last year, 1980, the death toll reached around 10,000, rising to about 13,000 for 1981 as the Reaganites took command. In October 1980, the new archbishop condemned the war of extermination and genocide against a defenseless civilian population, waged by the security forces. 2 months later, they were hailed for their valiant service alongside the people against subversion by the favorite U.S. moderate, quote-unquote, Jose Napoleon Duarte, as he was appointed civilian president of the junta. The role of the moderate, quote-unquote, Duarte was to provide a fig leaf for the military rulers and ensure them a continuing flow of U.S. funding after the armed forces had raped and murdered 4 churchwomen from the U.S. That had aroused some protest here. Slaughtering Salvadorians is one thing, but raping and killing American nuns is a definite PR mistake. The media evaded and downplayed the story, following the lead of the Carter administration and its investigative commission. The incoming Reaganites went much further, seeking to justify the atrocity, notably Secretary of State Alexander Haig and UN Ambassador Jeane Kirkpatrick. But it was still deemed worthwhile to have a show trial a few years later while exculpating the murderous junta and, of course, the paymaster. The independent newspaper in El Salvador, which might have reported these atrocities, had been destroyed. Although they were mainstream and pro-business, they were still too undisciplined for the military's taste, and the problem was taken care of in 1980 through 1981, when the editor of one was murdered by the security forces. The other fled into exile. As usual, these events were considered too insignificant to merit more than a few words in the U.S. newspaper. In November 1989, 6 Jesuit priests, their cook and her daughter, were murdered by the army. That same week, at least 28 other Salvadorian civilians were murdered, including the head of a major union, the leader of an organization of university women, 9 members of an Indian farming cooperative, and 10 university students. The newswires carried a story by AP correspondent Douglas Grant Mine, reporting how soldiers had entered a working-class neighborhood in the capital city of San Salvador, captured 6 men, added a 14-year-old boy for good measure, and then lined them up against a wall and shot them. They were not priests or human rights campaigners, Mine wrote, so their deaths have gone largely unnoticed, as did this story. The Jesuits were murdered by the Atlactl Battalion, an elite unit created, trained, and equipped by the United States. It was formed in March 1981 when 15 specialists in counterinsurgency were sent to El Salvador from the U.S. Army School of Special Forces. From the start, the battalion was engaged in mass murder. A U.S. trainer described its soldiers as particularly ferocious. We've always had a hard time getting them to take prisoners instead of ears. In December 1981, the battalion took part in an operation in which over 1,000 civilians were killed in an orgy of murder, rape, and burning. Later, it was involved in the bombing of villages and murder of hundreds of civilians by shootings, drownings, and other methods. The vast majority of victims were women, children, and the elderly. The Atlactl Battalion was being trained by U.S. Special Forces shortly before murdering the Jesuits. This has been a pattern throughout the battalion's existence. Some of its worst massacres have occurred when it's been fresh from U.S. training. In the fledgling democracy that was El Salvador, teens as young as 13 were scooped up in sweeps of slums and refugee camps and forced to become soldiers. They were indoctrinated with rituals adopted from the Nazi SS, including brutalization and rape, to prepare them for killings that often have sexual and satanic overtones. The nature of the Salvadorian army training was described by a deserter who received political asylum in Texas in 1990. Despite the State Department's request that he be sent back to El Salvador, his name was withheld by the court to protect him from the Salvadorian death squads. According to this deserter, draftees were made to kill dogs and vultures by biting their throats and twisting off their heads, and had to watch as soldiers tortured and killed suspected dissidents, tearing out their fingernails, cutting off their heads, chopping their bodies to pieces, and playing with the dismembered arms for fun. In another case, an admitted member of the Salvadorian death squad associated with the Atlactl Battalion, Cesar Velamin Joya Martinez, detailed the involvement of the U.S. advisors and the Salvadorian government in death squad activity. The Bush administration had made every effort to silence him and ship him back to a probable death in El Salvador, despite the pleas of human rights organizations and requests from Congress that his testimony be heard. The results of the Salvadorian military training are graphically described in the Jesuit journal America by Daniel Santiago, a Catholic priest working in El Salvador. He tells of a peasant woman who returned home one day to find her 3 children, her mother, and her sister sitting around a table, each with its own decapitated head placed carefully on the table in front of the body, the hands arranged on top as if each body was stroking its own head. The assassins from the Salvadorian National Guard had found it hard to keep the head of an 18-month-old baby in place, so they nailed the hands onto it. A large plastic bowl filled with blood was tastefully displayed in the center of the table. According to Reverend Santiago, macabre scenes of this kind aren't uncommon. People are not just killed by death squads in El Salvador, they are decapitated and their heads are placed on pikes and used to dot the landscape. Men are not just disemboweled by the Salvadorian Treasury Police, their severed genitalia are stuffed into their mouths. Salvadorian women are not just raped by the National Guard, their wombs are cut from their bodies and used to cover their faces. It is not enough to kill children, they are dragged over barbed wire until the flesh falls from their bones while parents are forced to watch. Reverend Santiago goes on to point out that the violence of this sort greatly increased when the church began forming peasant associations and self-help groups in an attempt to organize the poor. By and large, our approach in El Salvador has been successful. The popular organizations have been decimated, just as Archbishop Romero predicted, tens and thousands have been slaughtered, and more than 1 million have become refugees. This is one of the most sordid episodes in U.S. history, and it's got a lot of competition.